Here we are for another study of the book of Proverbs, and we're going to be in Proverbs chapter 17. Chapter 17. Occasionally in Proverbs there'll be a group of verses put together on a particular subject, but in chapter 17 that's not the case. If you had to put a heading in front of every topic that's mentioned, I would suppose you'd have as many headings as you have verses. He hops around quite a bit, as you'll notice. So let's begin in chapter 17 of Proverbs with verse 1. Better is a dry morsel and quietness with it than a house full of feasting with strife. How do you measure success? So often we want to measure success by abundance, by a lot of things, by a lot of food, and by great feasting. And Solomon says the real measure of success is, do you have peace? Is there quiet and tranquility? And he says it's better just to have a dry morsel, as long as you have peace and quiet, than a large feast with strife. Good to remember. Verse 2. A servant who acts wisely will rule over a son who acts shamefully, and will share in the inheritance among brothers. This seems to be a theme. Shameful, foolish children. And he says that there are sometimes a case where the child is going to be overruled by a servant, by an employee, that they'll have to oversee, and they'll even replace the son when it comes time for inheritance. He's often mentioned this type of thing, and he'll mention it a little bit more later, so we'll wait for it then to look at some references. Verse 3, the refining pot is for silver, and the furnace for gold, but the Lord tests hearts. We know that we can purify gold and silver in fire, and God tests our hearts. You know, temptations and trials and afflictions were never intended by God to cause us pain. What God intends for us to learn through affliction is how good our heart is. He wants us to become stronger and purer in heart. In 1 Peter, the first chapter, Peter mentions this. In 1 Peter 1, verse 7, he writes, so that the proof of your faith, being more precious than gold, which is perishable, even though tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Our hearts are imperishable. We are imperishable. Gold and silver, well, they can perish, but not our hearts. And so he's just reminding us of these things here. Verse 4. An evildoer listens to wicked lips. A liar pays attention to a destructive tongue. There used to be an old saying, birds of a feather flock together. And that seems to be what he's saying here. Evildoers, they listen to evil. A liar listens to people who lie. And it says something about our culture, I think. We live in a culture that lives on the next scandal. It runs on rumors and gossip, even lies. And so he's just reminding us that really tells us a lot about who we are. Because evildoers listen to wicked lips. A liar pays attention to a destructive tongue. Verse 5. He who mocks the poor taunts his maker. He who rejoices at calamity will not go unpunished. You mock the poor and you mock God. Why? Because God made this person. God loves this person. God values this person. God cares for this person. And if you start mocking them because they're poor, that is not the value of a person, how much money he has or doesn't have. And so we have to be careful how we treat that person who may be homeless, who may be down on his luck, who may be struggling at a particular time. Be careful that you don't mock them. And it's so easy to do sometimes. It's so easy to label them as mentally ill or drug users are, whatever else the thing might be. But there's a lot of reasons why people are poor. And so be careful not to mock the poor, because when you do, you taunt God himself. Verse 6, grandchildren are the crown of old men, and the glory of sons is their fathers. Our children's children are so wonderful, we call them grand. They are our grandchildren, our grandsons, our granddaughters. And he says they're like the jewel on a king's crown. How wonderful to have grandchildren. I can remember well each time one was born, and they're marvelous. And on the other hand, I think about my father. My father is the warmth, I think, of his love. I think of his personality. And he says here that the glory of sons is their father. I'm proud that I had a father who loved me and who was a respectable person. Verse 7, excellent speech is not fitting for a fool. Much less are lying lips to a prince. It seems like you can't get more than 2 verses in Proverbs, and he's going to start talking about the tongue again. It just seems like a constant thing. And what he's saying here is our speech reflects who we are. And so excellent speech, well, that doesn't go with a fool. And much less are lying lips to a prince. Be careful how you talk. It reveals who you are. Verse 8. A bribe is a charm in the sight of its owner. Wherever he turns, he prospers. That's an interesting comment, isn't it? Here it reminds us that Proverbs is practical to the extreme. There are some folks who think they can buy their way through life. And it seems like they get away with it. Their way prospers. And he just tells us a bribe is a charm in the sight of its owner. He thinks he can get away with anything. And wherever he turns, he prospers. That's the practical side of it. Verse 9. He who conceals a transgression seeks love, but he who repeats a matter separates intimate friends. It seems like some folks think it's their job to point out the weaknesses and mistakes of others, to gossip about others, and to talk about it. And he says gossip is evil, and it's not loving. It is judgmental, and it is hypocritical, and we have to be careful that we don't spread rumors. And that's what he's saying. It's interesting. He who conceals a transgression. So we don't go around talking about other people's sins. We don't broadcast their mistakes. We don't broadcast their weaknesses. Because he who repeats a matter separates intimate friends. We tell on somebody else and we put a wedge between him and his friends. And sometimes that's the objective of people who spread rumors. It's the objective of gossip to make someone look bad. Now, it's interesting that he says this here, because if you compare it with chapter 16, verse 30, he seems to say just the opposite. He says, he who winks his eye does so to devise perverse things. He who compresses his lips brings evil to pass. He says, don't wink at evil. Don't ignore evil. If you see something, say something. And then on the other hand, he says here, don't spread things about other people. And so it almost seems a contradiction. He who conceals a transgression, who hides it, he seeks love. And so what's going on here? Well, there is a time to speak. And there's a time to shut up. There's a time to speak when you see something that needs to be corrected, something that is criminal. But it's evil to gossip, and it's evil to spread rumors. It's not loving. And so here, there's a time to speak and a time to be quiet. With wisdom comes discernment. It comes the ability to tell when to speak and when to be quiet. Verse 10. A rebuke goes deeper into one who has understanding than 100 blows into a fool. It seems like a wise person is easy to teach. Perhaps there's enough said right there. Verse 11. A rebellious man seeks only evil, so a cruel messenger will be sent against him. A cruel message is often of the rebel's doom. The messenger is going to say of your doom. His ultimate desire, you notice this, he's a rebellious man seeks only evil. That's his desire. His ultimate desire is what's going to ruin him. It's what's going to do him in. Verse 12. Let a man meet a bear robbed of her cubs rather than a fool in his folly. There is perhaps nothing so fierce as a mama bear with her cubs. Don't get between a mama bear and her cubs. She will destroy you. And he says it's better to be with a mama bear with her cubs, separated from her cubs, than it is to be with a fool. He's dangerous. Watch out for him. Be careful. Be on your guard. This fool can do some really serious damage. Verse 13. He who returns evil for good, evil will not depart from his house. It often seems like there's not ever a good turn that goes unpunished. But when somebody does that, and some people do it quite often, after a while, nobody's going to help them. And what is even worse is if this happens over and over in our culture to no good turn goes unpunished, pretty soon none of us want to help anybody else. And all we're going to have is evil. And that's the result here, he says. He who returns evil for good, evil will not depart from his house. Verse 14. The beginning of strife is like letting out water, so abandon the quarrel before it breaks out. You know, sometimes it's easier to let a cat out of a bag than it is to put him back in. And that seems see what he's saying. He says, quarrels just escalate, so stop it before you start. Stop the argument before it starts, because it's like letting out water. Once the dam breaks, there's no stopping it. So watch what you're saying. Be careful. Verse 15. He who justifies the wicked and he who condemns the righteous, both of them alike are an abomination to the Lord. Here he's talking about a common theme about justice and injustice and what is just and what is unjust. In fact, this reminds me so much of what Isaiah said. Isaiah, the 5th chapter. Isaiah, when he prophesied, he warned the people because this had become a way of life for them at that time in their culture. Chapter 5, verses 20 and following. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who substitute darkness for light and light for darkness, who substitute bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and clever in their own sight. It seems like we live in a society that often calls the good evil and evil good. They call the black white and the white black. They turn things around, and he's warning us here about being just. It is unjust to call a good person evil, and it's unjust to call an evil person right. And so he's just trying to make sure that we use justice when we speak of other people. Now, in Malachi, the 2nd chapter, verse 17, there's a similar statement here. He says, you have wearied the Lord with your words. Yet you say, how have we wearied him? In that you say, everyone who does evil is good in the sight of the Lord, and he delights in them. Or, where is the God of justice? God, he delights in the evil person. God's grace will cover him. God's mercy is there for him. We pervert justice. You've wearied God because justice is just not there. Sometimes I get so frustrated our highly charged environment and social media where things get twisted up so badly. But there's the warning here about that. Verse 16, why is there a price in the hand of a fool to buy wisdom when he has no sense? A fool thinks that he can buy wisdom. It is not for sale. It is a foolish student who thinks he can buy knowledge with his tuition. Knowledge doesn't come with tuition. Knowledge comes with a yearning heart and hard work. And wisdom is not something you can buy with money either. It takes the same desire for wisdom, a seeking after wisdom, a learning of what wisdom is. And a fool, he just tries to buy it and he'll never find it that way. Verse 17, a friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for adversity. A true friend is there in the hard times as well as the good. A true friend, a true brother is someone is there for you no matter what you're going through. That's the true test of friendship. That's the true test of brotherhood. They never leave you or forsake you. And so it's pretty clear. A friend loves at all times. A brother is born for adversity. Verse 18. A man lacking in sense pledges and becomes a guarantor in the presence of his neighbor. Now, this is a theme we've seen over and over in the book of Proverbs, and it's very clear. Don't co-sign for anyone. Don't guarantee anybody's loan. You will be on the hook for it. And he talks about this over and over. He says, you're lacking sense if you make this agreement. You become a guarantor in the presence of his neighbor. Don't do it. Verse 19, he who loves transgression loves strife. He who raises his door seeks destruction. This is really a lot about pride in this verse. It doesn't seem like it, but it is. The proud love to argue. They love to show off. They love to prove to you just how smart and how much they know. He loves transgression. He loves strife. He loves arguing his way, even though it's evil, trying to convince you that it's good. And we see that so often today. And then he says, he who raises his door seeks destruction. And that sounds strange to us. He who raises his door? Well, this needs some clarification because this is truly an old Hebrew idiom. This is truly a proverb that is very much made sense of by what's going on in those days. Most houses and most courts in Palestine have low doors. The doors are no higher than probably 3 feet. And why is that, you'll ask? It's because of the Arabs. Arabs are hardly ever off horseback. They don't get off their horses, and so they had to lower their doors to keep these marauders from coming into their houses. And the guy who has so much pride, he just raises his door. He has so much ostentation that he raises his door. Well, he is just begging for trouble. He is looking for destruction. And that's what he says. He who raises his door seeks destruction. Be careful of where your pride takes you. It can take you to strife. It can take you all the way to destruction. That's an interesting passage. Verse 20. He who has a crooked mind finds no good. He who is perverted in his language falls into evil. Mind and the mouth go together. And he says the person who is crooked in mind, he finds no good. The person who's perverted in his language falls into evil. You can tell a person by the way they think and by the way they speak. And so he's talking about this is how you can tell those folks. You can't think one way and talk another way. They go together. And so we need to watch our attitude and watch our hearts and watch our minds. Back in chapter 4 of Proverbs, a very memorable proverb, verse 23. Watch over your heart with all diligence, for from it flow the springs of life. Then he follows that, put away from you a deceitful mouth and put devious speech far from you. Goes together again. Watch out for your heart and watch out for your mouth. Those two things go together. Verse 21, he who sires a fool does so to his sorrow, and the father of a fool has no joy. This seems to be a theme in Proverbs. Most of us have children we are proud of and we respect, but he talks here about those who have sons and daughters who are fools, and they bring great sorrow to their parents. You can compare this to verse 25. If we jump ahead just a little bit, he says, a foolish son is a grief to his father and bitterness to her who bore him. If you go back to chapter 15, in verse 20, it says, a wise son makes a father glad, but a foolish son despises his mother. A foolish son, it reflects badly on their parents. It hurts their parents. It's a grief to their parents. And he talks about this. Your child can make you so proud, or he can bring shame and grief and heartache into your home. And that's what he's talking about here, is the sadness of having a son who's a fool. And it reflects on a previous passage up there in the first part, verse 2 of chapter 17, where he talks about a servant being even better than some children that you have. Verse 22, a joyful heart is good medicine, but a broken spirit dries up the bones. Laughter is the best medicine, we sometimes say. You know, our mental attitude will determine sometimes how we are doing physically. Doctors will tell you this. If you have a good mental attitude, if you have a good outlook on life, if there is joy and contentment, and you have this mixed with wisdom, you will probably be pretty healthy. But on the other hand, if there is depression and grief and discouragement and anxiety and mental illness, that often leads to physical illness as well. Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 4:13, we do not want you to grieve as those who have no hope. There is a grief that comes to people who are not Christians and don't have the joy that we have. You see, the hope gives us joy. It brings us joy that he says will be good medicine, but a broken spirit dries up the bone. Our attitudes towards life, whether it is positive or negative, is going to have an impact on how we do physically. And we know this to be true. Some people have back pains that's caused by anger. It's caused by anxiety. It's caused by other things. And how many problems have we experienced through life because of the stress of life? And so be careful that you have a good positive attitude. Verse 23, a wicked man receives a bribe from the bosom to pervert the ways of justice. A wicked man receives a bribe from the bosom. Now, when he says the bosom, that's where they kept their wallet. And so a wicked man receives a bribe from somebody's wallet to pervert the ways of justice. Somebody gives a bribe and they're paying someone to look the other way, to bend the rules just a little bit. They want some kind of special treatment. And so he just says, a wicked man, that's the one who's looking for a bribe. It's a wicked man who perverts the ways of justice with a bribe. Verse 24, wisdom is in the presence of the one who has understanding, but the eyes of a fool are on the ends of the earth. So wisdom is there with somebody who has understanding. The fool, though, his eyes are on the end of the earth. His eyes are always in the wrong place. He's always looking in the wrong direction at the wrong things. A wise person knows how to focus on what's important. A fool, he's all over the place. And so be careful. Verse 25, a foolish son is a grief to his father and bitterness to her who bore him. Again, we come back to that theme that we already mentioned back in verse 21. Verse 26, it is also not good to find the righteous, nor to strike the noble for their uprightness. Once again, we come back to that same concept we had before about injustice, about calling the good evil and the evil good, injustice again. We can go back to verse 15. He said pretty much the same thing there. He who justifies the wicked, he who condemns the righteous. And this time he says it's not good to find the righteous, nor to strike the noble for their uprightness. Verse 27, he who restrains his words has knowledge, and he who has a cool spirit is a man of understanding. He who controls his words. Speech control. Know when to speak and know when to shut up. Sometimes we open our mouth just to change feet. We put our feet in our mouth all the time. And even a fool knows that if he's quiet, that he'll be perceived as wise. At least he's wise knowing that he needs to be quiet. And even the silver-tongued orator can talk too much. And so he who restrains his words has knowledge. And he who has a cool spirit, he's got discipline. He's not hot-tempered. He is quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger, as James will say. Verse 28, even a fool, when he keeps silent, is considered wise. When he closes his lips, he is considered prudent. A wise guy knows, hey, if I just keep quiet, I'll be perceived as wise. So don't talk too much. This is such a strong emphasis in the book of Proverbs. It seems like there's only two ways I get in trouble. By what I say and by what I do. And so half of my trouble comes from what I'm saying. And whether it's what I'm saying or what I'm doing, it all comes from my heart and what I'm thinking. And so Solomon is trying to get us to focus on where our mind is. Focus on wisdom. Think wise thoughts. Have understanding. Have insight. Have knowledge. And then you'll have wisdom that will give you prudence and give you discernment and allow you to make good judgments. You know, sometimes Proverbs is like outlining the dictionary. I mean, it is so hard to outline chapter 17. He just goes from one topic to another, and that is true for most of Proverbs. I don't know, is there anything that stands out for you? What was important there for you? I like the importance of having a positive mental attitude, quietness, contentment, humility. Each statement, each parable deserves its own time of pause, of meditation, of memorization, of transformation. And so as we come and look at these Proverbs over and over, and as he often says a common theme, as he talks about some things that he's going to talk about again and again, he comes at it from a little bit different angle, just to emphasize the importance of what he's talking about. Well, I hope we're blessed by looking at the book of Proverbs. I thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to joining you again later in the week for the next chapter. God bless you.